All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Airports Adapt, Creating a Resilient Operational and Terminal Environment. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I'm particularly excited to be with you today because today's webinar actually represents the culmination of a 3-month research sprint into the impacts of COVID-19 and its effects on the social fabric of our lives. You know, Corgan and our research and incubator group, Hugo, have been looking into these impacts across multiple building types and recently released our comprehensive COVID-19 impact study titled Design Informed by the Pandemic. This study goes into many detail on many aspects, including my favorite, designing trust and building wellness back into the environment. You can find this study in its entirety on our website, www.corgan.com. A large portion of that research was directly informed by our extensive aviation practice, whose focus over the past 70 years has been terminal architecture and its continued advancement. You know, as a part of that sprint and the focus of today's webinar, we've packaged our findings specifically into an aviation-centric document that we call Airports Adapt, the Social Paradigm Shift in Terminal Design. This is also available in its entirety on our website. These two publications highlight the way our aviation practice has evolved over the years by naturally immersing ourselves into tangential aspects of aviation design, such as terminal planning, optimization, strategic advisement, and experiential design. We are able to offer this broad perspective in which we've examined the current pandemic. Today, we've assembled some of Corgan's leading industry experts to specifically discuss these findings. Before we do this, let me introduce myself and let the panelists introduce themselves. I am Scott Gorenc, a studio design director within our Dallas Aviation Studio. My focus over the past 12 years has been terminal planning and design with a focus on process innovations and passenger experience. Jonathan?
Thanks, Scott. Yes, I'm Jonathan Massey. I'm co-aviation sector leader for Corgan's aviation practice. My background includes 27 years of experience in terminal planning, design, and architecture in many locations around the world. My project experience spans from relifing of 60-year-old terminal buildings to most recently leading the design for the world's largest concourse in Shanghai, Pudong. I'm also responsible for leading the development of our internal research group, Hugo, which Scott mentioned, as well as developing emerging design tools and techniques for our firm.
Thanks, Jonathan. Brent, why don't you go next?
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Brent Kelley. I'm our other co-sector lead for the aviation practice. I'm a managing principal in the firm, and I'm the director of our Los Angeles office. My career spans over 30 years of experience in planning and design, and I've had an emphasis on aviation projects. I've led the design of major terminal programs, including LAX Midfield, Sacramento Terminal B, and DFW Terminal D. I'm also a member of the Design Build Institute of America, and as such, I focus primarily for the last 17 years on the design, build, delivery method, working with our contractor partners.
Great. Ross?
Yes, hi, my name is Ross Payton. I'm a principal at Corgan in the aviation market sector. I'm also the Dallas studio leader. I've been in the aviation market sector for 25 years now, and I've done projects that range from regional airports all the way up to the busiest airport in the world in Atlanta. But most recently, I've been involved with Nashville's B&A Vision projects in Austin, as well as the Seattle Sustainable Master Plan.
Great, great. And last but not least, Ginger.
Hi, I'm Gee Difurio, design director for the Aviation Studio. I have 20 years of experience, and with the last 12 years with Corgan, focusing on aviation interiors and experiential design. My experience ranges in terminal work, both domestic and international, and premium services such as clubs and VIP lounges. A few of my notable projects are Dallas Love Field Airport, Abu Dhabi Terminal 1 refurbishment, and Shanghai Pudong Airport satellite concourse.
Great, great. Well, let's first talk about the impact to the industry as a whole. You know, it's been swift and significant passenger traffic originating in the U.S. dropped roughly 2.25 million passengers at the start of March to a low of approximately 90,000 passengers a day. That's over 95% decline. While passenger traffic starts to pick up, thankfully, now we're sitting at roughly 400,000 passengers a day. Undoubtedly, the impact of the pandemic is going to be long lasting. It's IATA projected that we're going to see a total loss of passenger revenue in upwards of $314 billion across 2020, which is roughly $860 million a day and $35 million an hour. So we've got a long way to go. So, disruption, however, is not something that we're not used to. If we look at some of the major projects that Corgan has been a part of over the past 20 years, they've had to feel the impact of disruptions, whether it be natural disruptions such as the one that we're in now, terrorist disruptions such as 9/11, or others like economic and technology disruptions such as the introduction of the A380 or Uber causing the total shift of our curbsides. So as we feel the impact of these disruptions, our terminal work persisted, and ultimately we had to respond. So first, I'd like to address a question here to Brent. Across your career, are there any similarities between COVID-19 and some of the disruptions I mentioned? And is there anything that we can learn from them?
Well, absolutely, Scott. The science of architecture must always respond to changes, and that's just what we do as architects. These major disruptions are normal course of business. And as such, when we really think of COVID, that is really just one more. I know we'll talk more about the specific impacts of COVID momentarily, but over the last decades, there have been numerous impacts, as you just described. And it's really forced us to think differently about terminal design. Prior to the 1970s, the airport terminal was really just another building, with the exception that airplanes were parked outside. As a direct result of hijackings and other impacts, in the 1973, I believe it is, the checkpoint actually came into being. And that is a milestone in which the paradigm shifted, and we had to think differently about how we designed airports because we had this major component to accommodate. But since then, there have been other numerous disruptions in the industry, as you noted. And, thinking about over my career specifically, how we've had to design to these paradigm shifts, what comes to mind really is the 9/11 events that really, really changed the impact to the terminals.
Right. And at the time of 9/11, you were overseeing the construction of Terminal D at DFW, right? So, how did the project respond?
Absolutely. And leading up to 9/11, security, while it came into effect in 73, it was really focused on what was carried onto the airplane versus what was loaded onto the airplane. And that made a big difference. This single event of 9/11 really changed how we think about it, designed from both a public and support space standpoint in the terminal. Thinking first of all, when we were designing Terminal D during 9/11, we had to adjust the building footprint to accommodate the screening component, the baggage screening component that now was becoming a requirement. This required us to reconfigure planned areas of the terminal that we already had to facilitate that screening requirement, as well as looking at the right-of-ways throughout the building for the conveyors. Secondly, from a design perspective, we had to rethink the concourse. Once we had this increased security measures in place and the restrictions of ticket passengers only to the concourse, we really had to rethink that because the security checkpoint equipment got bigger, the process got longer, so we had to accommodate that, which meant more space in order to do so. Then past the checkpoint, we had to kind of really rethink the passenger flow. What were the things that were necessary for recomposure? What were the things necessary to accommodate this captured audience, if you will, such as increased concessions and other amenities that the passengers now needed in that confined space? So when I think about my career and what's happened, I look at it and I know that we learned from these events, but I also suggest that the greatest lesson that we have learned, especially from 9/11, was the need for flexibility to accommodate future changes. History shows us a lot, and it tells us a lot about from a guidance standpoint, but it's really the one thing I know that has been said in the aviation history is the one constant is change. And when we think about from 9/11, it's really about designing those soft spaces next to and adjacent to the major passenger processing requirements That way they can move if they need to, and we get the infrastructure components as far away from those as possible, giving us that ultimate flexibility.
Yeah, great point. And Jonathan, Brent touched here on 9/11 and talked about the expansion of program areas and things like that. Specifically as it relates to this pandemic, what are some changes that you can forecast for the terminal environment and passenger journey?
Well, that's a good question. While the focus is certainly on the near term and jumpstarting the industry, I believe it's really important that we understand the context within which we're making these crucial first steps. The scale and complexity of this event is unprecedented, and its nature is fundamentally different from previous significant events that have caused the changes that Brent has talked about. It seems that the unique nature of this occurrence is causing some confusion and hesitation in how we do respond to it, and is this a one-time event or a potential repeatable threat to aviation? However, the first step is, in answering your question, is to recognize that this will indeed have lasting impacts on aviation due to the pandemic. Consider that until this moment in time, past events triggering such change have been man-made events with malicious intent, such as acts of terrorism. But we've responded to every act of terrorism with changes designed to prevent those from acting again, regardless of the likelihood of them happening again or the cost to implement those changes. In those cases, it was quite clear that these steps were critical to the ongoing viability of aviation and, more importantly, maintaining the public's trust in it.
Jonathan, you make a great point basically about what we should be anticipating and what we should be designing for. As we coordinated this research effort, everything from the guidance from the CDC to projections changed daily almost. So, it became important for us to ask, not necessarily how we design in response to the pandemic, but how can we design informed by it?
Well, exactly. And I think it's easy to get lost in the detail and the changes every day and the new equipment being proposed. I think it's important for us to take a step back and really look at the situation as a whole. Again, this event was not man-made with the intent to cripple economies, but that's what it did nonetheless. So in that sense, it may be more comparable to a natural disaster. In the case of a threat of natural disaster, we take every precaution we can to protect the facilities and the lives within it by defining new special design requirements, such as designing buildings for flood events, hurricanes, tornadoes, or earthquakes. We have no idea of the timing, intensity, or location of these potential future events, but we all agree that to take steps to mitigate these risks is crucial to avoid erosion of trust in our industry, which is completely unacceptable. So to come back to your question, we really must learn everything we can about the range of potential health threats, not just specific COVID-19 issues, but really a range of health issues and what those threats are, create a response framework for those threats, which take into account the specific risk profiles of those, and apply those strategies across planning, design, and construction spectrums. The specifics of how the pandemic will inform design practices will come from this exercise. We've created a working concept around this approach, which we're continuing to develop and hope to show at some point in the future.
Yeah, great. The interesting part about this is that, we know that the aviation is agile to respond to these disruptions, but it's not so easy to create that built environment. Both you and Brent touched on things like soft space as a way to respond, but, Ross, let me throw this your way. This concept of future proofing, is a critical aspect of terminal design. What are some design strategies that we can employ that in response to the pandemic?
Yeah, sure. Future proofing is really an interesting topic in general. I think there's a little bit of a misconception of what future proofing really is. I think a lot of people say, well, I want it future proofed. And then they're thinking that, we can design a facility that doesn't need to change as these disruptions occur, when in reality, we just need to be as flexible as what Brent said. We just need to be as flexible as possible. And that really comes down to, we only know what we know today. So how do we get the information so that we can design these facilities to be as flexible as they can be? Well, a couple of design strategies that we can employ include just gaining information and letting us listen to the client. Through a planning process, we engage the client. We first talk about the future and what they see happening. What are their goals and expectations for those projects, so that we can get to where they need to be, whether it's 10, 20, or 30 years down the road. That way, whenever something like a COVID-19 or a 9/11 happens, we can respond, and we can respond knowing that there's flexibility in their program. So whether it's planning, incorporating kind of our predictive design analysis or risk modeling techniques, we can guide them to that long-term plan. Next, I think building a roadmap on how to get there is very important, because this allows us to not only consider the project that we're in now, but what other projects are coming down the road, making sure that our project doesn't necessarily hinder the other projects. But obviously, there are a lot more basic techniques that can occur. I know Brent mentioned the hard and soft spaces. I think we just need to be prudent in where we place those elements within our design. That way, walls, doors, they can easily come down. But when it's plumbing or communication closets, those get in the way and cost a lot more. So just be deliberate in where we place those. Another thing that is kind of, I guess, one of my issues is designing to minimums. In our industry, we design to the minimum requirements all the time. So as requirements change, increase, or standards increase, the adjustments become that much harder to employ into the projects. Finally, don't be afraid of change. Things are going to happen. Things are going to adjust, whether it's an airline or a disruptive technology. And we need to be able to change that long-term plan and roadmap in order to accommodate those. Change is inevitable.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Change is inevitable, and change will happen. So, I think let's dive in to some of what we've researched in regards to changes specifically to the experience within terminal design moving forward after COVID-19. And as a part of our research, we identified three larger buckets of information that we needed to study further. First was social distancing. Second, touchless processing. And third, wellness. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a brief overview of each of these three, and then ask questions of the group here in response to some of our findings. So first, with social distancing, the concept here, it was important for us to recognize that while we may be ruled by a spatial guideline today, here in the U.S. it's 6 feet, in the long term, the impact of social distancing is really going to be about a redefinition of personal space. So first, this means to us boundary by design. How can we implement amenities that are passenger focused, but also help define personal boundary, whether in the short term with adaptable components or in the long term with new amenities. Second, it's about dwell anywhere, dwell everywhere. How do we discourage the high density clustering of passengers in areas like hold rooms and vacuum halls? And what we're looking at is in particular dwell amenities, things like lounge spaces or experiential pop-up retail, as a way to pull people apart and disperse passengers. And then finally, the concept of decentralization. Whether this be in the macro by looking at ways to break apart high-touch processing elements such as security checkpoints or passport control, or through the micro through decentralizing queues and having individual queues per lanes as a way to naturally segregate passengers. What are things that we can do so that by design we provide a healthy sanitary environment for passengers and workers in the terminal environment? So with that, I'd like to ask a couple of questions, and I'm going to start off with Ginger and ask her specifically about social distancing and the 6-foot rule. IATA has come out and said that social distancing should be a recommended protocol as we restart the aviation industry. And so in order to help facilitate that, what can we learn from other industries, and what should we implement into our airport designs? For example, we've seen things in grocery stores such as decals on the ground to help tell us where to stand, or plexiglass barriers. What's applicable to the aviation industry?
Yeah. So Scott, there are a few short-term strategies we're looking at in terms of social distancing. And one of the most talked about topic is whole room seating. Currently on the market, we're seeing offerings such as seat covers, stickers, or banners that you can apply to the seats and leave them open. There are also a variety of protective plexiglass shields that can be installed over existing millwork. In our research, we actually developed prototypes of furniture components, such as privacy screens that can be clipped onto the existing chair arms, and seat tables that can be slid over existing seats to create personal spaces. These components were designed to be flexible, encourage social distancing, but also as amenities to provide hospitality for the travelers. Another topic for the whole room is processing and crowd control. How do we minimize groups of passengers crowding at the gate? We can achieve this first by segregating the flow of deplaning passengers. We can use stanchions to mark their own lane and direct them out of the whole room area. Similar concept can be applied to boarding passengers as well. Single lane defined by stanchions with floor decals to space people out. We have a big section on crowd control in our best practice report, so check it out if you want more in-depth information. And I also want to circle back to the grocery store, Scott. There are many lessons we can learn from the grocery stores. We have seen floor decals and plastic shields, but really I'm most impressed by the level of customer service they provide. Take Trader Joe's as an example. They have attendants that help customers to form a line to wait at the door. They sanitize your cart right in front of you when you enter the store. The staff are extremely friendly, and there are positive messages throughout the store, such as safety is our top priority, or we are all in this together. The key to this is short term, aside from the physical modifications to the building environment that we can do, we really need to tap into travelers' psychological comfort. For the majority, travel by air is a choice, not a necessity. And we will have to go above and beyond to gain passengers' trust so they can feel safe to fly again.
Yeah. Great point, Ginger. And Brent in particular, when we talk about, and as Ginger brought up, the human behaviors such as crowding around gates, and right now we're trained to be spaced apart. But seemingly in the long term, social distancing, is going to be harder and people will forget, So how do you see this being implemented in the long term?
Well, I think Ginger brings up some good points, and your question's good as well, in that, I don't know that we really understand the full impact of social distancing on terminal design yet. I think what we do know is the pandemic by its very nature has caused the social distancing to happen naturally. I think when we start to think about more in the future, what does that mean as employment start to come back? Ginger did mention all the temporary measures that have been in place, whether it's the decals or the seating or different things that help maintain that separation. And I think other measures will certainly come into play as we know more and as we research more into the pandemic and what needs to happen. I think, as Jonathan hit the point, is not just for now, but for the future design and the development, designing to what we know, not because of what we know. So I think, again, adaptability of space, you're going to hear a lot in this conversation that's what's required. It's not really a new thought or a new process of designing soft spaces, but I think what it is a renewed focus on where and how you place those soft spaces. Mm-hmm. If you think about the terminal, it really acts as a filter. It's a filter that serves us for boarding that aircraft, things that come through. And when we think about it pre-COVID, that was for weapons. We were concerned about the weapons, and that's what we wanted to filter against. Now in the post-COVID world, we need to really think about how does the terminal filter passenger illnesses so that when you do get on the plane, you feel confident that you're safe to be there.
Yeah, you bring up a great point with the employments being so low and the passenger traffic being so low. It's easy to social distance right now in airports. But those numbers will grow and we will return. I guess, in the long term, when we do have our numbers back up, how can we best plan for social distancing, and how will that impact planning and the design of terminals?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good part of the conversation. It is ongoing. And as designers, we really kind of believe it will require some change. We're going to have to think differently of how we look at adaptable plans that we can easily convert when necessary. We certainly don't want to design to a pandemic. I was talking with someone not too long ago, and they said, we really don't want a terminal that was designed in 15 years, people look back and say, oh, that was designed during the COVID era. So we want to make sure that we don't do that. But the challenge will be to design areas that are dedicated to passenger processing in such a way that they can be dispersed, really thereby lowering the contact points that people have to go through. I think a good example is a security checkpoint. TSA, from an economy standpoint, prefers to have that single checkpoint. And while it's better if we can diversify those checkpoints and have multiple locations, it may not be possible. So what do we do if it's not possible? Well, one thing might be to look at how we disperse the number of lanes. So rather than everyone in a post-COVID world queuing up in a single lane, all packed together, is there a possibility to spread those lanes out to bring people in from different directions so that they can still filter through the same location, but not have as many contact points along the way? Processing times will also, I think, improve and will help that in the future. But on the concourse, I think we must also consider the designs that encourage passengers to disperse and to dwell in multiple locations. I like your comment of dwell anywhere and everywhere is a good example of how to think about that. And we're now starting to really get into the graying of the lines between the hold room and concessions. How do we create those ability for people to disperse themselves, have more comfort level? It's also the idea, like we're doing at Midfield Concourse today, is creating hold room neighborhoods. So it's not just a single hold room dedicated to a gate, but hold rooms that are shared by multiple gates. So if one gate's not in use, you can spread out a little bit more. Other design alternatives I think you mentioned as well are pop-up amenities, things that attract people, such as art galleries or specialty retail, where you encourage that movement throughout the terminal without that congregating in one central location because you're afraid you're going to miss your flight.
Yeah, one of the things that both you and Ginger brought up was really the human-centered design aspect of social distancing, and inherently those two concepts kind of run against each other. Social distancing is all about separating people from each other, but in reality, a lot of our designs are there to facilitate human interaction. So I think this is a good question for Jonathan. How do we do social distancing, but also maintain and foster that human experience that we're known for?
Well, that's a good question. The topic of social distancing and its long-term impacts on terminal spaces and public gatherings in general is an interesting one, due to the unique time we're in right now. The shutdown, sheltering in place, PPE, all of that is really, introduced something new and different and unknown into our daily lives. So we're obviously questioning, how do we continue to live and do business in this situation and maintain human connections, as you suggest? Some people are looking at this as the new normal. Some are looking at this as a once in a century event that will soon pass and we'll never have to think about it again. Our view is, and what we would propose is that the reality is somewhere in between, and that social distancing will become a tool to be employed when future conditions require it. Just as certain security protocols are enforced when certain physical threat conditions exist. So I'll talk about that timing and protocol aspect a little later in our session. But when conditions do call for social distancing protocols to be in place, there are still methods available to provide an elevated experience. When you look at what actually defines a positive experience, you consider aspects such as stress levels, convenience, comfort, and control over one's own experience. Certainly, human interaction is a component, but even that means different things to different people and different demographics, right? Technology is redefining human interaction with each passing generation. Through our years of research on the aging passenger population, we found it's clear they prefer one-on-one human interaction, which will need a lot of focus in social distancing situations. But younger generations actually prefer to deal with technology rather than humans. So it's not a blanket solution. It's a strategic approach depending upon the situation that you're in. Some of the proposals we are advocating for in our pandemic research and our Airports Adapt series could not only mitigate the impacts of the future pandemics and those risks, but they could actually improve passenger experience in those conditions as well as on a daily basis, if you think about this strategic and tailored approach that I just described.
Yeah, great point. And speaking of the research, we should dive back into our topics here. And so the second aspect of our research was actually touchless processing. And what that meant for us is really a reevaluation of the whole user experience from start to finish at the airport. How can we make that more fluid, and how can we minimize the interactions, particularly at high touch processing elements? First, we looked at how we could refocus just the basics, things like reducing queues and affecting things like how people show up to the queue, how people are processed in what order, and how fast they're processed. Second, it was about trying to achieve a just-in-time processing model. If we were to implement an appointment-based processing model where we identify passengers who are either at risk or who haven't flown in a while, and provide them a time to show up where they could go through at a concierge level of service, that could have a better overall impact for their experience, but also down the line as it impacts queues. And finally, how do we harness the technologies to achieve the promise of a biometric airport? This has been an aspiration for many years, and so now it's time to capitalize. For example, as we capitalize on this, we need to anticipate things like the evolution of the security checkpoint beyond a singular checkpoint, and ultimately the resulting impact to the whole experience. So, if we look back at the basics, Ross, what can we do in the short term that maybe isn't reliant on technology to help achieve a touchless processing experience?
Yeah, I mean, touchless processing is definitely something that our white paper focuses on. It really is not just about the passenger, but really every user within the airport, whether it's the ticketing agent, TSA officer. So what is their journey through the airport, and how can our processes make this safer for them? This really comes down to redefining the overall experience. You mentioned the whole process that we live in. We do this first, we do this second. How can we change that up to make it beneficial for everyone? Let's take a look at the ticketing process first. Historically, the ticketing process was you go up to the counter, you buy a ticket, you drop your bag, and then you go past security. Well, that really doesn't happen today. Most people buy their tickets online and really only need to drop their baggage at the counter. But we're still operating as if everyone needs to go to the ticketing counter itself. If we can just go ahead and do some of the automated processes, I know that we can now bag tag at home. We can do self bag tagging and literally just drop it at the counter and go on. It's not only good for the passenger, but it's good for the agent as well. The security screening process, there was some comments talking about queuing, social distancing. I've seen some chat comments come up as well. This idea of on time or telling people when to arrive, assigning them a time to get to the security checkpoint, reduces the number of people in the queue at the peak times. You're flattening that curve. Again, this helps reduce exposure. It helps allows for social distancing through the process, not necessarily as easy as maybe markings on the floor. The boarding process, the actual ticketing agent has been scanning our boarding passes for us if they're paper. Why not go ahead and allow the passenger to scan that? you take out that interaction altogether, that's good for both the passenger and the gate agent. One process that has changed recently that is inherently good in this situation as well is in the Customs and Border Protection arrivals. Going to a bags first scenario is a good way to think of this as changing the process. You're now able to dwell anywhere and everywhere while you wait for either your bag, or you can go through the line. You're actually able to control where you are within the process versus just queuing up for document control. Technology is constantly being mentioned in this overall, discussion we're having, but it's not the silver bullet. It's not always going to be the answer. So how do we implement physical solutions, knowing that there is some potential technology in the future that may happen? We're not wanting to do any kind of knee-jerk response.
Yeah. When I think your point about the bags first process at the CBP is spot on. That just a simple evaluation of the critical path and a readjustment of a couple of things result in a net gain for everyone. And that doesn't involve technology. And so Ginger, I would be remiss to not mention our favorite topic. The restroom experience. I know that we have championed the restroom experience for many years. So as one of the most impactful spaces on the overall satisfaction of the airport, what are some strategies that we can consider for restrooms, knowing that you can't make a restroom fully touchless?
Thanks, Scott. Somehow I always get restroom questions. Touchless restroom experience has always been best practice for us, even before COVID. For the existing remodel that you mentioned, I think automatic fixtures such as faucet, soap dispenser, paper towel dispenser, and flush valve can be retrofitted into the existing facility. In larger restrooms, we're also seeing a trend of installing occupancy indicators, such as tush lights, similar to the lights you see in parking garages. We're also seeing automatic door hardware and foot-activated stall doors being specified. Additionally, it is our recommendation to place touchless hand sanitizing stations throughout the terminal. We just need to make sure to remind our travelers that this is an aid to the hand washing and not a replacement to the hand washing process. Another thing worth mentioning, as far as for the restroom fixtures, that since COVID, new studies suggest that hand dryers circulates micro with air movement that resulted in significantly more viral contamination than paper towels. In this study, the volunteers were instructed to not scrub after they were exposed to a virus. And don't worry, these viruses is not harmful to humans, so the volunteers are fine. They were instructed to not scrub to simulate poorly washed hands, and then they dry their hands either with paper towel or hand dryer. After that, they touched 11 surfaces, including doorknobs, handrails, phones, and armchairs. And the results showed that all 11 surfaces, including all 11 surfaces that's being touched by hand dryer, that they were all contaminated. And only 6 after the paper towel drying that's contaminated. So while paper towel was not perfect, it is definitely the better choice. And now we can talk about stages for new restroom designs. Traffic flow has always been a hot topic for restroom layout. One strategy is single flow layout restrooms, where we separate the entry and exit of the restroom block to reduce two-way traffic. Mm-hmm. Enlarging the circulation and stall sizes is also another strategy. This will allow users more space to maneuver and ultimately reduce surface contact. For lavatories, we're looking at individualizing the hand washing process, meaning the sink, mirror, soap, paper towel, and trash are all within a single user's reach. This will reduce cross-reaching and dripping. And additionally, a more progressive idea, if you will, is a single occupancy restrooms. One restroom per user with all the amenities in the unit, and the restroom is sanitized after each use. So we understand that these ideas, a spacious restroom concept, it's a luxury for most projects because we simply just do not have the real estate most of the times. One strategy we can consider is to elevate the level of customer service with restroom attendants. They can help pace the traffic flow. They can monitor the cleanness of the facilities. Not only that they look clean, but also smell clean. And again, this is to provide that psychological comfort to the passengers, again, as we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, very important. And I think there's a lot of talk about technology that we'll talk about later on in wellness. But to get back into that for touchless processing, Jonathan, the promise of that biometric airport that we talked about at the beginning, has been an aspiration for some time. What technology besides biometrics is important for us to be able to achieve that biometric airport?
Well, a very loaded question. I think to address this issue, we really need to step back and discuss what the problem is that we're actually trying to solve. Because I personally believe it's not just a technology issue, but it's a cultural issue. There's lots of precedent in the world of technology being able to build systems before we have a need for them, right? Having the tech is great, but in order for it to become invaluable to people, we need to have an undeniable and important need for it. Think back to the original killer app, which hopefully everybody's familiar with that term, but it was called VisiCalc, and it was a program designed by Apple in the early 80s. It was the first spreadsheet, and it was $100 piece of software that drove people to spend thousands on computers so they could run it. That may seem to be a very odd reference, especially for an architect to make. But my point is that mass adoption of technology happens when it can be linked to an important, widespread, and obvious need. Some of the foundational tech for touchless processing, such as facial recognition, for example, has been around since the 1960s. There has been little widespread need for it in the aviation industry because there's really no widespread database of facial information to compare it against. Today, technology in aviation has been leveraged to drive processing efficiencies, better data management, security tracing, and so on, as a force multiplier. We've always understood that the enhanced passenger experience potential of using facial recognition and touchless processing is enormous, but it's been difficult to quantify. However, when you consider how the passenger experience perspective has been changed by the heightened focus on disease spread in the recent events, the value of touchless processing in terms of the passenger experience and designing trust in the aviation system, it takes on a whole new meaning. So the missing link, or perhaps the key to achieving the biometric process, as you suggest, could lie in personal data, its collection, protection, application, and perhaps most importantly, anonymity. If we could get to that point and tie it with the tech that already exists, then we can achieve that promise. The potential, however, in terms of positive impact to the passenger's experience is incredible. It would enable seamless or invisible processing. It would allow passengers to take control over their own experience and tailor it to their own preferences. It would streamline and drive commerce in the terminal in ways that it can't today. But perhaps most importantly, it would allow the passenger's journey to return to what it was at the beginning, which was an adventure and not a burden.
Great point. And I like the way that you described it, the experience there at the end. And, Brent, I think, a great question for you would be is that, knowing that that's ultimately what we would like to achieve, what do we need to accommodate today to make that experience happen?
Well, I think it's really kind of twofold to answer that question, Scott. It's really kind of looking at what we can do today, but I also kind of like thinking of looking to the futurists, those who kind of forecast what technologies will do and what it can mean for us. I think the discussion of biometrics, facial recognition has, as Jonathan mentioned, been around for quite some time. And these technologies, as they bring value, as Jonathan mentioned, will change terminal design, and it will force us to think differently how we lay out those spaces and what infrastructure is really necessary to support that technology. I kind of look at it and say it's likely that the current events will accelerate some of the development of these. And I think that's kind of the exciting part for us to think about. And I think when we think about that, where it can have the greatest impact will be the passenger processing. I know Ross mentioned a lot about that as far as what can we do ourselves. So that's always something for us to keep in mind when we're designing. But of course, one of the greatest potential changes that I see would be the checkpoint. I've talked a lot about the checkpoint because it is the point in which clogs up the system, if you will, because everyone must pass through it. So for thinking for a moment of the future, what could the look of that checkpoint be? How could it change so that it is a more seamless process, a quicker process? If you think about the continued advancements in technology and how it's reducing processing time and things of that nature, it will only help us and give us more options about what it means for security. Think about it. Do we need that security checkpoint with advancements of technology? Or could it be you're screened as you walk through the vestibule through the front door? Could it be that you're screened as you're entering the hold room or as you're about to board the gate? So is there really going to be in the future that need for the security checkpoint as we know it today? I'm kind of going to date myself here, but if you're familiar with the movie Total Recall, that's a scenario where the futurist was looking forward about what security might look like. And if you think about it, was a simply walking through the entry zone that the main character Quaid was processed in seconds rather than minutes. And that process revealed not only that he had a weapon, but you could see his whole skeletal frame as well. So we don't know exactly what those technologies will be, but we know that they will be coming. And for us, it's really thinking about how do we adapt. So drawing it back to your first question about what do we do now? How do we start thinking about it now? I think it's really key to think about what future technologies we'll need and will drive. And the best way I believe airports can be accommodating today is to recognize that increased need for the infrastructure and really developing the most robust backbone possible. Now, it does come at a cost, but being aware of that, how can you get the most out of your systems? We've already seen an enormous increase in the number of connected components within the terminal building just for the terminal and the systems to talk to each other. Back of house areas and terminals will certainly change. We're already experiencing larger IDF rooms and things that need to be located closer to the endpoint so that it's faster response time. We're also seeing a greater need for Wi-Fi bandwidth. Now everything is over the Wi-Fi, and so emergency communications, the operational equipment talking to each other, as well as passenger connectivity, that's become a big component within the terminal facilities. And I think about your smartphone. Just about everyone has one today. So we know that will continue to propel technologies as well because people have that information at their fingertips. You already think about your ability to order concessions in many of the airports across the country today and have it ready for you when you are ready to board your gate. But what else might happen? We're already exploring the idea of, and this gets a little wary here, but the idea of passenger tracking, understanding profiles. We do that anyway. If you go on Google to search for something, they know what you're searching for. So how do we propel that into creating that customer experience, but making sure the airport is prepared to accommodate that? So, I think to kind of end that thought, the great thing about airports is that it's a building type that is accustomed to change. Perhaps it's the creativity of our airport operators, or maybe the creativity of our designers, or I'm thinking probably a little of both, that somehow we always find possibilities of how to adapt to change when it occurs. But the advance of these new developments, airports should also plan on increasing that infrastructure, making sure that the capacity and the right of ways are there, so that when the time comes, it's an easier transition without reworking a lot of the components and the facility itself.
Yeah, great point, Brent. So I think we're going to dive into the last component of our research, the wellness aspect of this, and wellness is really going to become a fundamental part of the DNA of the airport facility. Passengers will expect that a facility that the airport facility puts their health and well-being first. As passengers return to the sky, step one will be all about reassuring that they're doing so in a safe and sanitary environment. And here the diagram of the restroom talks to a lot of what Ginger mentioned earlier in the discussion. Second, it'll be about incorporating technologies such as UV lighting and infiltration methodologies to help elevate our sanitation protocols. And finally, we need to create and implement an adaptable solution that responds to the changing risk levels that passengers and operators face in the terminal environment. These protocols can be operational, infrastructural, or experiential, but the overall objective will be to create a space that enhances the well-being of the users. So, Ginger, let's dive into a quick question for you. Much of the CDC guidelines that have come out and much of the IATA recommendations is about doubling down on sanitation protocols. How can we, as a design firm, help airport operators operate at a better capacity?
That's a good question, Scott. As I mentioned earlier, minimizing cross-flow traffic and interactions will drastically reduce the spread of germs. But aside from layout of the facility, what else can we do? We are looking at 4 additional areas for us to explore. First is the evaluation of surfaces. Are all the counters, shelves, or furniture in the building a necessity? Can we find a balance to streamline the design while still providing amenities to the passengers? For example, providing hooks instead of shelves or for bags and purses in the restrooms, or providing standing height tech bar or changing stations to eliminate the use of bar stools. Second is the evaluation of materials. For example, should we continue to use carpet and soft seating, or should we opt for materials that are easy to clean with antimicrobial properties? We know that materials such as metal, especially copper, has a natural alloy that kills bacteria. And there are also flooring that were manufactured with antimicrobial additive called microban. Additionally, silicone is a great material that can stop or slow down spreading of germs. They can be used for door handle covers and seat upholstery. And third, what we're looking at is the ease of maintenance. We know that airlines have to use electrostatic sprayers to clean all the hard-to-reach spaces in the aircraft. So how do we design to reduce the nooks and crannies in buildings? For example, can we specify seats with openings between seat cushion and back, so there are not no crevices for the crumbs to live, or to use larger format floor and wall surfaces to minimize joints and grout lines? And lastly is the transparency of the sanitation process. Making the cleaning staff and process visible to the passengers goes a long way. If they can see the environment is being cleaned, not only they will feel better, they will still respect the process more. We can also allow passengers access to sanitizers and wipes to wipe down their own seats if they prefer. And another thought is that we can create a digital platform where customers can provide feedback to the cleaning staff live from either kiosks or their own mobile devices. The bottom line is there are numerous ideas and solutions that we can explore as a design firm. It is our responsibility to work with owners, vendors, and manufacturers. And together we can evaluate cost versus impact and have the right data to tap into industry trends and to future-proof our design and recommendations.
Yeah, great point. There's a lot of emerging things coming out, and some of that is technology based, like UV lighting, and like you mentioned, electrostatic fogging. Ross, question for you. As we start to see things like automated UV robots coming into the concourse and going into the bathrooms, what are your thoughts on how we can help best integrate that into the wellness program at airports?
Sure. First of all, wellness is something that is grown in appreciation by just the younger generations. Recently, either in the ADAPT paper that we just submitted, or even the podcast, the YouTube podcast, The Square, we talk about this concept of building science. Building science is something that is not just an architecture is involved or an architect or an engineer. It's really a multidisciplined approach to how we deal with the building performance, making sure that it's a healthy building, it's functioning, whether it's longevity, energy usage, or just overall wellness. The younger generations are demanding more and more of this concept of wellness in general, just how they interact with the environment, work, play, live in, all these different areas that they interact with. How does this really advance? Well, really, this thing called the psychology of trust is something that we need to pay attention to. How do we communicate and let others know that we're concerned for their well-being, whether it's how the building's performing or how we've designed the space? We need to gather data that's real time to tell us, are the systems performing like we designed them to perform? In the psychology of trust, there's this pre and post COVID scenario where pre and post vaccine, how do we react and interact with the spaces? Right now, companies today are talking about how do we get back into the office or the public space, and cleaning standards and expectations are increasing. They demand more and how they can assure that my space is clean and I'm safe. Well, the healthcare industry has been using some of those technologies like UV and far UV, electrostatic fogging for a long time, but we're really just now starting to look at that in the airport environment. So how do we test and monitor the results of any action we take? Testing and monitoring is a touchy subject. With our litigious society, it has been something that hasn't been required previously. Owners may not have wanted to know how things were performing. Otherwise, they may be required to fix it or spend money to improve it if they did know. But it's a huge shift in thinking right now. We need to know. So technologies in general, medical industry's been using these. We're putting them into our public environments and airports. We can't overlook the importance of just a thorough cleaning.
Yeah, I think one of the takeaways for me is both the comments you made and Ginger made about the strategic partnerships we make as we start to investigate these emerging technologies. And so Jonathan, I'll leave this with you. Looking into the future, what are some of the strategic partnerships? What are some of the initiatives that we can put forth to help help the industry respond to the next disruption?
Well, that's a good point. We do need to look to the future. We've discussed the opportunity we have regarding the potentials of technology to find great value when applied to the touchless process, using targeted social distancing, touchless biometrics, building wellness techniques, can not only provide the operational efficiencies that we're looking for, but they can also provide real health benefits and perhaps even more importantly, play an integral role in designing trust into the process. However, one last thing I'd like to hit on is the topic of creating a health response strategy. This strategy could provide a framework of actions in response to different topics of global or regional health events. This could provide guidance to airports and airlines on specific steps to take under various health risk conditions and how to apply those consistently across a national system or larger geographies. We can take lessons, as Ross was just speaking about, from the healthcare industry who have created a path to defining processes for design, construction, and operation relative to different health environments in different parts of hospitals. We believe this could be applied to aviation by designing a series of health event levels and their specific risk profiles, then applying those profiles across multiple classifications of space types to create a strategy for clients to follow. One of my favorite quotes is, "In the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity." We've talked about a lot of things over the past hour about what those potentials are. We really need to challenge preconceptions, outdated opinions, and yesterday's obstacles. we have a really great opportunity to reimagine and redefine the possible based on everything that we've talked about and truly capitalize on the opportunities in front of us.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I think, in closing, I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. I know there's been lots of questions in the chat and in the Q&A. I know we're running up against time, so I promise that whoever you've directed those questions to will respond back to you and continue the discussion. If there's other questions that you'd like to ask after you review the recording, please reach out to me or the other panelists. We'd be happy to continue the discussion. I'd encourage the group to please make sure to download the COVID-19 impact study located on our website, www.corgan.com, under the blogs. Also, be sure to check out the Airports Adapt for the aviation-specific features. And while you're there, you might as well also check out the Curiosity Report, which reflects our ongoing research into how emerging technologies could influence design and construction in the future. Thanks again for attending, and we look forward to talking in person next time.